Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and I'm joined tonight by Barry Malone. Great to have you back.
Hi, Michael. Good to be with you. Ready to talk about more own goals by the Labour Party.
There's an own goal by the Labour Party, unless you're Wes Streeting, in which case it's your lucky day. Of course, we are discussing tonight whether Wes Streeting is about to make a bid for Labour leader, whether he was going to before a bizarre barrage of briefing began. Also, huge protests at the COP summit in Brazil. I'll be discussing that with someone there, what people are protesting about. And we'll be discussing the dreadful Sudanese Civil War and the role of the UAE in funding and fueling that. And we'll end the show with more revelations about Donald Trump's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Some bombshell emails have been released. With approval ratings lower than Liz Truss and a painful budget just 2 weeks away, Keir Starmer already looked weak. But a botched round of briefings last night has now made his position look pretty much untenable. And the bizarre drama started last night when a senior Downing Street source briefed a number of newspapers that Wes Streeting was planning a leadership bid. So this was how Bloomberg reported it. This is one of the newspapers briefed. They said Starmer supporters privately accused Health Secretary Wes Streeting of plotting to replace the Prime Minister, according to people familiar with the matter. They argued that any attempt to oust Starmer would risk a market shock and undermine the government's finances, said the people, who asked not to be identified discussing internal disputes. Now, the idea that markets would be terrified of Wes Streeting, who, if anything, is to the right of Keir Starmer, sort of the Blairite, I find that a little bit odd. Also, I don't think Keir Starmer can just keep saying, you have to do what I say, or the markets are gonna hate us. It's not a convincing political narrative. In any case, this same story was briefed also to the BBC. Their headline: Starmer will fight attempts to replace him, allies say. It also appeared on the front page of The Guardian, who said the story, which the speculation about Streeting was given to them by Starmer's most senior political aides. Suggests probably Morgan McSweeney. It was also on the front page of The Times, where the briefer accused MPs of being feral. Now, if your leadership is in trouble, accusing the only people who can bring you down, which is the MPs, of being feral, is an odd choice. I'm not sure what the strategy is there. We'll discuss some theories later on. In any case, Wes Streeting was able to use the rash set of briefings to his advantage on a pre-planned morning media round.
You'll forgive me for asking about the rumours of a coup. So what is going on? The allies of the PM saying that if there's a leadership challenge after the budget, the PM will fight it. So what, is there a leadership challenge? What's happening?
No, and I think whoever's been briefing this has been watching too much Celebrity Traitors, and this is just about the worst attack on a faithful I've seen since Joe Marler was kicked out and banished in the final. It's totally self-defeating briefing, not least because it's not true. And I don't understand how anyone thinks it's helpful to the Prime Minister either to suggest he's fighting for his job at a time when, last time I saw him on Monday evening to talk about violence against women and girls and how we tackle it, he's fighting for the country and trying to turn it around from the absolute mess that we inherited. So
what's your message then to people who have been briefing this? What would you say to them?
Well, firstly, I'd like to commend them for at least taking on board the feedback about sexist briefings, because we've seen this before. Lucy Powell, Bridget Phillipson, Angela Rayner could go around pretty much the entire cabinet table. So at least they're picking on one of the boys now.
So he looked comfortable. He has a joke to hand, obviously pre-written, but a joke nonetheless about a TV show that everyone in the country has apparently watched. And then he's sort of connected his experience to that of other female MPs, particularly soft left ones, like Lucy Powell, who would be useful if he wanted to become leader. So well played so far, Wes Streeting, I suppose. Sophie Ridge also put some of the specific allegations briefed to the papers to Wes Streeting.
There's a few specific allegations about you that have been put out in the last 24 hours. I want to put them to you directly. Firstly, there's the Times. Downing Street figures suspect that Streeting could demand the Prime Minister's resignation in the days after the budget. Are you going to rule that out?
Yes, and nor did I shoot JFK. I don't know where Lord Lucan is. Had nothing to do with Shergar. And I do think that the US did manage to do the moon landings. I don't think they were faked, certainly not by me.
What about after the local elections next year? Is that a point when, if you do badly, if you lose in Wales, that it could be time for a change at the top?
Well, I'm not planning for us to do badly. In Scotland, we've got a dynamic
Can you
leader.
rule it out? Can you rule it out demanding the Prime Minister's resignation?
I'm not going in to demand the Prime Minister's resignation. I support the Prime Minister. I have done since he was elected leader of the Labour Party. I didn't vote for him in the leadership election, but I did support him from the moment he was elected. And I supported him all the way through at points when he did things that no one thought was possible.
So Wes Streeting seemed to be enjoying himself there, relished the chance to show he can crack out a joke under pressure. Also actually didn't rule out trying to knock Keir Starmer out of position after next year's local elections. He just said that's not what he's doing. It's not the plan. But anyway, he looked comfortable, as I said, which was a contrast to Keir Starmer at today's PMQs.
The truth is, he says these attacks aren't authorised. That means he's lost control of number 10, because that's where they're coming from. But the real scandal, Mr. Speaker, the real scandal is that 2 weeks from a budget, the government has descended into civil war. Instead of fixing the mess they've made of the economy, they're all... Mr. Speaker, they're all chuntering. These are the feral MPs that number 10 has been talking about. They're not my words. They're number 10's words, his words. But unbelievably, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's advisors have been reduced to briefing that MPs can't get rid of him, and I'm not making this up, they can't get rid of him because it would destabilise international markets. Why does the Prime Minister think that there would be a market meltdown if the Health Secretary took over?
Mr. Speaker, this is a united team and we are delivering together. Look what we're doing. The fastest group in the G7.
This is a united team, and everyone just bursts into laughter. Kemi Badenoch clearly enjoying herself. As I think is pretty obvious here, last night's briefing, of course, has left Keir Starmer in a much weaker position than he was in, and he already was in a weak one, and Wes Streeting in a stronger one. He's been briefed against, and he comes out looking, I suppose, both like he can handle pressure, because he did reasonably well on the morning rounds, and also like he's not necessarily continuity Keir Starmer, because he can claim to sort of be under attack from Keir Starmer, a man who no one now likes. So what were the briefers thinking? What was the plan here? What were they hoping? Well, of course, as I've said, it's widely assumed that this briefer was Morgan McSweeney, feeding these stories to the paper. And there are three theories, maybe more, but I'm going to tell you three theories as to what he was playing at. So the first was expressed by Sky's Sophie Ridge this morning in that interview with Wes Streeting.
Can I tell you what I think? I think that this was all briefed overnight, specifically so that you could say those things today on the morning round, right? Everyone knows that you're doing the morning round, you're taking questions from people like me. They're worried about the budget. They know how bad it's going to be. They know that in all likelihood, it looks like the manifesto is going to be broken. They want a public declaration of loyalty from the person who is seen as the most likely person to succeed the Prime Minister.
So that's, I suppose, the most obvious, the kind of mainstream explanation for what's going on, which is that this was genuine. This was someone who supports Keir Starmer, who wanted to take out opposition to Keir Starmer, and decided to do that by throwing out some stories about the person who would be most likely to replace him, and then to get that person to go on television and to be asked, are you a loyal person? Do you rule out standing against Keir Starmer? And so this was just an attempt to protect Keir Starmer against someone in competition with him, right? That would, I suppose, be the mainstream one. So it would be a cock-up, but it wouldn't be conspiracy. Maybe that's what Morgan McSweeney is like. Maybe he's just incredibly incompetent. Another theory is that the attacks on Wes Streeting were not an attempt by Morgan McSweeney to shore up Keir Starmer, but to clear the path for someone else. That was put forward as a possibility by Stephen Bush in the Financial Times. So he suggested, what is catching the eyes of MPs is that there is another candidate, widely believed by the party's power brokers to be the preferred choice of Morgan McSweeney, Starmer's chief of staff, or you might say his most senior political aide, which is how he was quoted in the newspapers. And he say that would be Shabana Mahmood, Home Secretary. Some see these stories as a 2-for-1 on McSweeney's part, an attack on Streeting, who he is not politically close to, and something that undermines his new boss to the benefit of his next boss. So the theory there is that this wasn't someone who was stupid enough that they thought these briefings would help Keir Starmer. They knew they would damage Keir Starmer, but They also didn't do it to benefit Wes Streeting. They wanted to take out both Starmer and Streeting, in this case, because McSweeney wanted to open the path to Shabana Mahmood. Again, if that was the plan, the problem is that this doesn't seem to have weakened Wes Streeting. Obviously, it has weakened the Prime Minister. It hasn't weakened Wes Streeting. And so that's where, again, maybe cock up to some degree. But there is a third theory. This was Owen Jones this morning. He said, my theory, the number 10 briefing was designed to boost Wes Streeting. It's almost certainly Morgan McSweeney, Starmer's chief of staff responsible. McSweeney is close to Streeting, so somewhat differing to Stephen Bush's interpretation there. Owen went on to suggest that McSweeney never really saw Starmer as the ideal candidate, but needed him to win over the membership. That's because at the time the membership were Corbynite. They couldn't go with someone who was explicitly from the Labour right at that point because they wouldn't have won. But they never thought he would be Prime Minister. He wins a general election by accident. And now they want to get rid of him. And Wes Streeting is their man. Wes Streeting is the kind of person who they would have put up to win the leadership election in 2020, but couldn't. So they needed this stand-in figure who was Keir Starmer, who they're ready to get rid of. And this was all a clever plot to make Wes Streeting look good. Owen also said this. So he said, this number 10 briefing came the night before Wes Streeting was already due to do a media round. It allowed him to put in a well-rehearsed performance that boosted his chances, as any idiot could have predicted. Streeting is on manoeuvres. This has helped him, and I think that was the plan all along. Now, the persuasive part of that is that any idiot could have predicted that Wes Streeting would have come across well in those interviews. So I think actually this theory is quite strong, that the person doing this briefing actually wanted to strengthen Wes Streeting, not weaken him. I suppose it depends how intelligent you think Morgan McSweeney is. If you think he's really dumb, maybe he was trying to shore up Keir Starmer. If you think he's, kind of smart, but not particularly smart, maybe what he was trying to do is attack his current boss and Shabana Mahmood and Wes Streeting to lay the path clear for Shabana Mahmood. If you think he's, playing four-dimensional chess, maybe this was to strengthen Wes Streeting all along. Whether or not it was intentional, so whichever theory is true, it does seem clear that this whole saga has boosted Wes Streeting's leadership hopes. Sienna Rogers at Politics Home tweeted this. Labour MPs say Wes Streeting's stock has increased, even among the soft left. Honestly, I think at this stage a broad spectrum of MPs are willing to heavily compromise on ideology in favour of competence, emotional intelligence. That's in quote marks, so from an MP speaking to Sienna Rogers, potentially someone from the soft left. Barry, I don't know if you have a favoured theory of those three. In terms of sort of what Sienna Rogers is saying there, it does seem like Wes Streeting's biggest barrier, everyone in the party seems to think he's a good communicator and reasonably competent, but he is seen as definitely on the right of the party. So if you wanted the government to shift to the left, he wouldn't be a favoured choice. But maybe by managing to position himself as a victim, or being enabled to position himself as a victim and to ally with some of the soft left women who've been briefed against by Keir Starmer's team, he now looks a much more attractive proposition to people across the party. What's your analysis of what we've seen over the past 24 hours?
I'm not a lobby correspondent, so I can't with certainty predict or speculate as to why this happened and who was briefing for what reason. Owen Jones' theory is very, very interesting, but as you said, you'd have to credit them with 4D chess there. And, I just don't think that people in the current Labour Party have proven themselves to be very good at politics since they came into power. There are times I don't think they can even play like 2D chess against a computer on easy mode. But exactly, you're right about what's happened, which is that Wes Streeting has come up smelling of roses. I suspect that it was an attempt to hobble Wes Streeting, and he's come out of it looking incredibly, incredibly good. You can see the reaction from sort of journalists and analysts across the spectrum today, which is talking about him being assured and him being slick and him being a polished media performer. He's able to go out there and make jokes about how he didn't kidnap Shergar, super impressive. But what kind of amazes me about that is those are all the same things that people were saying about Keir Starmer a couple of years ago. He's polished, he's slick, he speaks well. It seems insane to recall that now, but that is what people said. And now they're setting up sort of Wes Streeting as some antidote to Starmer, when in effect, what material change would Wes Streeting becoming leader of the Labour Party have for the Labour Party as it continues to implode? You know, I really don't understand why people who are worried about, you know, being voted out of office or losing their seats after just one term would think that Wes Streeting can save them. I mean, what does Wes Streeting stand for? It's very similar to the Keir Starmer thing, which is we haven't communicated very well about what we're doing. We haven't made the changes that we want to make fast enough. But again, with no real clear policy prescription. I think we spoke about this a few months ago when the first revelations were coming out about McSweeney, and I said that I thought Keir Starmer was toast. I may have got a little overexcited there. I still think he is. It's just a matter of when. So is it after the budget? Is it after the local elections in May? Look, we don't know, but it will happen. This man is not going to lead Labour into the next election. But if Labour are looking for a saviour, I just don't see it as Wes Streeting. You know, he's a polished media performer. Okay, is he as polished a media performer as Zach Polanski? Is he as polished a media performer as Nigel Farage? I would say he's not. And so I don't see how this is the solution to the threat that's coming from the right and the threat that's coming to the left. So look, Starmer's going to go. It's only a question of when. If it is Wes Streeting who replaces him, then I think the Labour Party is going to continue to fail.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't think Wes Streeting is the Labour Party's saviour. I'm not sure if anyone can save the Labour Party at this point. And I think, so if you were to look at what would be a different sort of strategy they could take, you would ideally want someone a bit like Andy Burnham who can sort of look a bit fresh, but also reach out to different parts of the party, sort of do a reset as a bigger tent. At the same time, though, it is weird because people did think Keir Starmer was a good communicator when he was... I do think he's got worse. I do think he has somehow got a little bit worse since he became leader. But he always was somewhat awkward. But I do think Wes Streeting is a much better communicator than Keir Starmer. And I do really think that one of the reasons Labour are so unpopular is because they didn't have a vision, but also Keir Starmer can't speak like a human. Like he always looks terrified whenever he's in an interview. And I do think that Wes Streeting, whatever decision he makes, if he were to be leader, whatever decision he makes in terms of policy, what direction he wants to take the party, he will have a better chance at explaining why he's doing it than Keir Starmer will. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I if I were a Labour MP who really wanted to keep my seat, I would definitely prefer to have Wes Streeting as leader than Keir Starmer. Whether or not he can, obviously the Labour vote is now massively split between the Greens and Labour. Whether or not he can bring back those people is a different question. He'd have to make some big, bold policy pledges to try and bring some Greens back. People sort of say he's too associated with the right. I don't think that many people in the public sort of follow factional politics. So I think if he were to make a left-wing sounding pitch to people attracted by the Greens, he might be able to shore up some support. It's difficult to know. But I think he probably will replace Keir Starmer quite soon. And I would imagine, I might be wrong, I would imagine Labour to go up slightly in the polls for a little bit. Still, Reform are going to be odds-on favourite to win the next election. Protests broke out last night at the COP summit in Brazil. This year's conference, held near the mouth of the Amazon, was supposed to be especially open to civil society and indigenous movements. However, protests by people representing Brazil's indigenous community boiled over last night, with hundreds of activists breaking through barriers into a part of the conference centre. Those protesters would go on to clash with security staff at the conference in scenes the Brazilian government had presumably been hoping to avoid. You can see clashes here. The UN said 2 guards suffered minor injuries. The clashes highlighted deep frustration between those on the front lines of the climate emergency and the people in charge of international climate policy. This is an interview from CNN with one of the protesters after the scuffles died down.
Para nós é um momento de revolta, é um momento de indignação, é um momento em que nós, indígenas, sentimos na pele a derrota do nosso território. Nós não comemos dinheiro, nós queremos o nosso território livre do agronegócio, da exploração de petróleo, da exploração de minério, da exploração de madeireiros. É a resistência!
Now, in case you're listening on the podcast, that was Cacique Gilson, an indigenous leader from the Tupinamba community, saying, We can't eat money. We want our lands free from agribusiness, oil exploration, illegal miners, and illegal loggers. To hear more about the perspectives and concerns of Indigenous people at COP30, I spoke earlier with Joseph Sikulu. Joseph is a Tongan Australian. He's a Pacific Movement lead at the Sunrise Project, and he witnessed the protest yesterday.
Yes, it was last night, and I was actually exiting the venue and was on my way out, and I saw the action was happening in the action area, and so upon exit outside of the COP venue, there are certain areas that have already been earmarked for actions to take place in, and it was happening within there. And for me, walking in, what attracted me was the look of ceremony that was happening, and they were dancing around and they were singing about it. And so then I was asking a few of the people around there what the protest was about. Juntos were there to protest the extraction of oil that's happening on their territory and the deforestation that is happening in order to allow that extraction. And what is being faced by their people at the time, like people are not just fighting for their livelihoods in their forest and their land, they're also fighting to stay alive because of the extraction that is happening. And so I joined because of culturally it just felt right. And then I just followed the energy as to where it was going. And then we're heading towards the entry of the COP venue. And then people started to go inside. And so I couldn't go any further than that because I'm on a government accreditation. But I saw the energy that was happening and the spirit that was being felt in there and the frustration that is being felt by people as they needed to go in. And it's one of these things that you come into COP and you always have to understand that there is a place for everything, whether we're in the negotiations or whether it's about a protest, there is a place for it all within this and it all plays a key role. And sometimes our communities don't find their way in, and sometimes the only way that they can manage to find that visibility or that voice is to protest in the way that it happened last night. And so whilst I see some of the stories that have been happening there, I fully stand in solidarity with everything that they're all standing for last night.
So this protest was by, as far as I understand, Indigenous people from the Amazons, as they were upset about certain local issues. I suppose if you could talk about that, but also you're there, I suppose, as a representative for a different group of Indigenous people from the Pacific Islands. So I suppose if you can talk about the issues as far as you understand it, which were motivating this protest and how that might link to the issues that you'd like to raise at this COP.
Our issues are all linked. Basically, we're all fighting for the same thing, and that's the right to self-determination. It's the right to be able to continue to move through this world with the dignity that we deserve. It's about trying to solve this crisis that has been created by the extraction that is causing harm to people, to Indigenous people everywhere. And one thing we know to be true, whether we're from the Pacific or we're from the Amazon, is that every single conflict in this world can be traced back to the extraction and dispossession of Indigenous people from their land. And that comes with a lot of everything that we need to do in order to fight back for that. And for some of us, like myself from the Pacific, we have access to this process, even though it's difficult. I mean, we have a very small contingent here at COP this year because it's hard to get to Brazil. It costs a lot and we haven't been able to, but we're still here. And there was a promise at the beginning of this that it will be an Indigenous COP, that it will be focused on the Indigenous people and that the Indigenous people of Amazon would have access to this, and that hasn't materialized. And so there is some anger in there. But at the end of the day, it really is about fighting to protect our homes and where we come from and trying to ensure that we're protecting these things for the future generations. And that really is what at the heart is what is at the heart of all of this.
So as far as I understand it, Indigenous people have actually had probably a bigger impact in this set of sort of international meetings than they have in others. I mean, obviously that makes sense. It is especially the Pacific Islanders who are going to be impacted most by climate change. So my understanding is that having 1.5 degrees as a target put into the Paris Agreement in 2015 was sort of the biggest win there has been of people from Indigenous movements and especially from Pacific Islanders. I suppose a decade on, could you talk about what difference that's made, if it has made any difference at all?
1.5 is ingrained into the Paris Agreement, and it continues to live as a red line in terms of what we need to continue to strive for in our ambition in order to ensure that humanity can have its best chance of survival, but also to ensure mostly that our islands have the best chance of survival. Over this last decade, we've seen attempts at being ambitious from our governments. They've set commitments to nationally determined contributions, doing everything they can to lower emissions, to committing to finances that are supposed to help communities transition and also prepare. But none of those have been met. And we're at a point now where this year, at the beginning of COP30, the UN Secretary General came in his opening remarks, told us that we are going to see us overshoot that 1.5 as early as the 2030s. And even if all of the countries at the moment meet their NDCs as they're currently set, that will still see us on a pathway to over 2 degrees, which spells disaster for the Pacific. And so that anger that is felt outside of here is also felt internally as well, because we're not just here out of frustration, but to ensure that our islands can survive and also have everything we need in order to adapt and continue to thrive through this process. And so we are not seeing anywhere near enough the ambition that is needed. And so, but we continue to engage in this process in the faith that the world will come and meet us where we're at.
So as far as I understand, one of the reasons why the UN General Secretary said that 1.5 was going to be, I suppose, missed, that we were going to reach that. I mean, in many ways we already have, because there was a year where temperatures were above 1.5, but that was partly because of El Nino. So it has to be a long-term average we reach to sort of say we have missed that target. But part of the motivation, as far as I understand it, was to highlight the need for adaptation. And I suppose Pacific Islanders, what kind of adaptation are they doing? So 100,000 people or so live in Tonga. I mean, is there adaptation that these low-lying islands can do, or will it at some point be the case of people having to make arrangements to leave?
There is adaptation, and adaptation measures are happening across our region, and there are some really innovative things that are happening in terms of trying to think of new ways to raise islands or reclaim land in order to ensure that we can continue to build out further. Looking at new ways of growing our crops and planting and innovations in agriculture, looking at different ways where we can continue to protect our ocean and fish. We're also looking at the Pacific becoming the first region in the entire world to be 100% renewable energy. And so that transition is a really key part of that adaptation piece and making sure that we can continue to access power. But unless we actually address the root cause of the climate crisis, which is the extraction of fossil fuels, then we will continue in this process. And so it's always going to be a key part. And addressing overshoot is, yes, about trying to drive our ambition in terms of adaptation, but it's also a warning sign. If we don't stop extraction of fossil fuels and if we don't transition this world, then that overshoot isn't going to be temporary, like the UNSG was saying. It's going to be a permanent thing. And so, but it is. And there are some really exciting things happening in our region. Tuvalu is actually going to be building their new Parliament House on completely reclaimed land. And it's going to be the first Parliament House ever built on land that hasn't existed before, because it's one of these countries that is going to be the first to be inundated by water. But everybody is thinking of new ways to try and ensure that we can stay on our islands, because nobody wants to go at the end of the day. Nobody wants to have to move.
And presumably, I mean, lots of that sounds expensive, land reclamation. Unless I'm wrong, maybe it can be done for low cost. But I would imagine that lots of this adaptation would be expensive. And I wonder where the money comes from. I mean, how does that work?
It's also part of these negotiations. And last year we had set on this new concept and CQG. Sometimes these acronyms confuse me being part of this process. The NCQG, new quantifiable goal. And the world had committed to this whole $1 trillion that we're trying to raise at the moment. And that's the important part of these multilateral processes, is the commitments that are being made, especially from the high polluting nations, to ensure that the global south can continue to adapt. In the Pacific, we're also developing our own financial mechanism called the Pacific Resilience Facility. And it's a mechanism built and owned by the Pacific, where we're going to be investing in our own enterprises, and then the dividends from them going into grants that will go directly to our communities for the adaptation processes. And so part of this whole negotiations process is trying to build the support for those finances that are needed for these adaptation measures.
The Sudanese city of El Fasher was taken over by the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, in the last week of October. And that's the armed group that's been fighting the Sudanese military since April 2023 in a civil war that has involved repeated massacres, ethnic cleansing, and famine. And in the western region of Darfur, well, Al Fasher is regional capital. A genocide is being carried out by the RSF and Arab militias against its non-Arab inhabitants. In El Fasher, the brutality of the killing is evident. The city had been under siege by RSF fighters for 18 months before they seized it from the Sudanese army late last month. And what followed was a massacre with this video posted online and matched the terrain by satellite imagery showing dead bodies lying in a ditch. Other videos verified by Reuters show men in RSF uniforms shooting unarmed captives. Obviously, we sort of blurred that because otherwise it wouldn't be allowed on YouTube. I suppose also so you can make your own decision whether you want to see the details of that. Obviously, those images are available online. Further crimes have been detected by satellite imagery analysis. This is from Australia's ABC News.
On October 27, just after El Fasher was taken by the RSF, war crime investigators at the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab noticed this, what they call objects and reddish earth discoloration appearing in imagery. The analysis says vehicles can also be seen blocking roads. The next day, the objects remain in place.
They did not appear in the baseline imagery from a couple days before. There was no presence of objects between 1.3 to 2 meters in length. And that range on the object is critical because a human body lying horizontally in 30 centimeter satellite imagery will measure in terms of pixels between 1.3 to full 2 meters. The discoloration, it's usually about a half a meter in size, and it occurs when the bodies first appear, and that's the blood discoloration. We mathematically measure it, and it comes back mathematically as true red.
At a university building on October 27, the scene repeats. The next day, more objects and discoloration can be seen. We have geolocated this video to inside the main building. It's extremely graphic and shows a man kneeling on the ground before he is executed. Many more bodies can be seen. Nearby, in a facility known as the Saudi Hospital, objects are again seen in imagery from October 28.
Now, 460 people are thought to have been killed by RSF fighters in that Saudi hospital. Abdu Rabu Ahmed, a lab worker, survived the massacre. He spoke to BBC News from a displaced persons camp 50 miles away from the city.
Right now, I feel extremely hopeless. I've lost my colleagues, the people whose faces I used to see smiling. There is no happiness anymore. It feels as if you've lost a big part of your body or your soul. I do not see any hope of returning to El Fasher after everything that happened and everything I saw. Even if there was a small hope, I remember what happened in front of me.
With the taking of El Fasher, where at least 1,500 people were killed, the RSF has shown itself to be an increasingly powerful force, and one not worried about leaving carnage along its path to what it hopes will be the end of ruling Sudan. But where does that power come from? Well, the answer is, at least in part, from the United Arab Emirates. The UAE has been accused of providing the RSF with advanced Chinese weaponry, despite an international arms embargo on the group. The UAE also appears to have channeled British military equipment to the RSF after being sold it by the UK. Earlier this year, the Sudanese government filed a genocide case in the International Court of Justice accusing the UAE of complicity in genocide. That case against the UAE was rejected in May. Sky's Yusra El-Bagir spoke to an RSF intelligence officer about the relationship between the group and the UAE under conditions of strict secrecy.
When you speak to RSF fighters in the field, what are they telling you about the support that they're receiving from other countries?
In the beginning, it was the Russians, Wagner and the state. Now, they say it is the UAE supporting the RSF. Many of the planes landing at Nayala are said to bring weapons from the UAE, and partially through the Amjarus airport in Chad.
Why do you think that the UAE supports the RSF? What's the mutual interest?
It's a financial relationship, no more. The RSF controls areas with large gold mines. Darfur alone has more than 4 or 5 gold mines, and the UAE is a gold trading hub.
The UAE's backing of the RSF has prolonged a situation that is already catastrophic. 21 million people are facing acute food insecurity, 12 million people have been displaced, and the number of people killed in the last 2.5 years is thought to exceed 150,000. Barry, I know you've been writing about the Sudanese Civil War on your Substack. We've been meaning to cover it for a while. I mean, we've covered it before, but not very recently. What should people know about recent developments in this conflict?
I just want to say, first of all, there was some really strong coverage that you just showed there. But I really think it shouldn't have taken the beginning of ethnic slaughter in El Fasher for major international organizations to wake up and start to give this conflict, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, the coverage that it deserves. There are honorable exceptions like Yusra El-Gabir, who you just showed there, who's an incredible journalist who has not faltered for a second in her coverage of this over the last 2.5 years. I think Lindsay Hilsum of Channel 4 News also deserves some credit. But, the silence from the major media organizations as this has gone on has been, I think, unconscionable. What's happening right now is incredibly dangerous because, what we may be seeing, and I think what we are seeing, is the continuation of a genocide that actually began 20 years ago. The Rapid Support Forces group grew out of the Janjaweed, who committed a genocide in Darfur a couple of decades ago, and its fighters have openly stated that they are now continuing that genocide. And to your question about the United Arab Emirates, they're all over this. Sudan has become a proxy war. There are many different countries involved. It's an incredibly complex pattern of alliances and countries trying to play one side off the other. But I think that it can be argued that the UAE is the most consequential outside country involved now, because without the support that they're given to the RSF, I should say that the United Arab Emirates denies that they're giving any support, but it's an increasingly absurd denial because there has been very, very convincing reporting from very respected media organizations that seems to have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that they are supporting the RSF. And without that support, you can argue that the war would have ended a lot earlier, because it's the UAE support that's been key to keeping the RSF strong. And that's been key to making it a more powerful force in its war against the Sudanese military. Weapons are coming in, supplies are coming in. They're coming in through incredibly complex routes. They're coming in through Libya. They're coming in through Chad. They're even coming from a port in Somaliland, where they are then being flown into Sudan, again in huge numbers. The thing about what's happening in El Fasher as well now is that it's been predicted. It's been predicted for more than 18 months since the RSF laid siege to the city, a brutal siege in which they built sort of sand berms around so that people couldn't get out. They constantly threw mortars at the city. They used drones to attack the city. They didn't let aid or food into the city, so people, were struggling with acute malnutrition. It was really, really a brutal 18 months for the people of that city. And everybody knew, Sudanese journalists, Sudanese analysts, the Sudanese people screamed for 18 months that when the RSF got into El Fasher, it was going to start slaughtering civilians. And that's exactly what we've seen. And we don't seem to have seen much pressure on the UAE over that last 18 months. And really the only country who could have stopped what we're seeing happen now is the UAE. I don't see any other way that the RSF would have been stopped from doing what it is now doing in that city. And in terms of why the UAE is involved, I think that's also a really sort of important question to address. And, it's partly sort of for reasons of gaining influence in the region. The UAE has become an increasingly powerful player in several countries on the African continent. It's been involved in Somalia. It's been involved in Libya. It's been involved in Egypt, in Chad, in Tunisia. It's becoming this sort of quiet background diplomatic power with a real hunger for influence, but also there's a massive monetary driver to this as well, which is that Sudan is awash with gold. And there is convincing evidence that the UAE is already shipping gold out of Sudan. There was one report that suggested that the gold trade might be bigger now than it was in peacetime. And I read one statistic earlier on today that said that between 2012 and 2022, 2,500 tons of undeclared gold from the African continent worth $115 billion was taken out to the UAE. We're talking massive, massive sums of money. And then there are other financial imperatives too. The UAE imports the overwhelming majority of its food, I think 95, 97%. And they have investments in agricultural land in Sudan. There's also Arabic gum, which is a mineral that they're very, very interested in. I remember, as far back as kind of 2010, 2011, I was living and reporting from Ethiopia. And they were buying up lots of agricultural land in Ethiopia as well. And, local people were being forced off that land and displaced by these massive projects that were financed by the Emiratis and some other Gulf countries. So, look, they're all over it. Right now, you can say that they're directly implicated in a developing genocide. And for 2.5 years, the world, and I think important to say, UAE's allies in the West have kind of looked away.
I suppose, so as far as I understand, the background is that Sudan had been ruled for about 30 years by an Islamist dictator called Bashir, who was overthrown in 2019. Al-Bashir had previously used the Janjaweed as sort of his shock troops in a previous civil war. They become the RSF. And then when Bashir stands down, you have sort of a power sharing agreement between the official Sudanese army and the RSF. And the reason this sort of civil war is happening now is because there was a power struggle between these two groups. And my understanding was that, this is not an ethnic conflict between these two groups. It's not an ideological conflict between these two groups. It's just sort of two sort of organizations or two factions that want power over the state, maybe so that they can sort of distribute the spoils of the gold or whatever. And I suppose what I'm struggling to make sense of is why for the UAE is it so worth backing one of them over the other? Because presumably the UAE could sign a deal for the gold mines with whoever takes power. Why do they need the RSF to win as opposed to the Sudanese army for them to get their hands on these gold reserves? I mean, can you make sense of that for me?
I think they actually have had, the UAE has exported gold in the past that's been from mines that have been controlled by the Sudanese armed forces, not the RSF. So they have done business with the Sudanese armed forces before, but most of the gold is in areas controlled by the RSF and in areas that are traditionally controlled by elements of the RSF. So yeah, most of the gold is there, and the RSF under Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, who's known as Hemedti, he's actually, he's running a massive business there, and the RSF is a militia, but it's also something of a conglomerate, and so I just think that they can get more gold from dealing with the RSF than they could get from dealing with the Sudanese armed forces. And also, it's looking increasingly likely that the RSF is going to end up in control of the Darfur region, where most of the gold is. And, we could be looking at a situation, especially now that the RSF has taken El Fasher, which was the last stronghold of the Sudanese military in Darfur, a split country. They've already declared some kind of a government in Darfur, some kind of a competing government. I don't know if we will end up looking at a sort of a Libya-like situation where for years there have been two competing governments. UAE is also involved in supporting one of those governments, I should say. And then there are also sort of supply routes from the regions that the RSF controls to the Red Sea. And the UAE is very keen on gaining more ports around the Red Sea region. So I think there are several sort of motivations for them to be involved with the RSF now in wartime more than they could get from waiting for peacetime and choosing a side.
I suppose that brings me to my next question, which is, I understand why everyone said, this hasn't been given enough attention. But there's also the question of what does international attention do? So I suppose most obviously there could be pressure put on the UAE to stop exporting arms which are being used in a genocide. That seems sort of plausible that pressure would make a difference and more media coverage would increase that pressure. So I get that. I suppose the civil war, though, will still remain, won't it? And I mean, I don't know if this is a sort of overly sort of brutal realist way of looking at it, but to some degree, with a civil war, you just want one side to win. Like, the worst thing that can possibly happen is for there to be two sides which are sort of equally armed, and then the civil war just goes on forever. What are we looking at here in terms of what the international, I mean, I don't like using the phrase international community, but what international actors should be aiming for here? Is it just sort of stop the arms going in? Is it sort of help negotiate some kind of peace? Should the West pick the government which is sort of to some extent recognized, which is the Sudanese army, the official Sudanese army, and help them defeat the RSF? I mean, what's the end game here? I mean, obviously it's a difficult question to ask during a civil war. What's the end game? But sort of how should we be thinking about this?
Yeah, when I've written about it in Proximities, I've usually come to the conclusion that it's really hard to see any end in sight. There have been several attempts at peace talks between the two, but they've always gone nowhere and fallen apart really, really quickly. Look, we know that with international powers, international Western powers, that they will only intervene when they see that it's in their own interests. I do think that the media coverage in the last, 2-3 weeks has applied extra pressure. And you can see that the RSF has said that it is open to negotiating some kind of a truce or some kind of a temporary truce. And I don't think that they would have said that if it wasn't for that media pressure and the fact that we started to see the UAE get blamed and embarrassed in the international media. The US and the UK and other countries are obviously very close allies of the UAE. I think you said in your piece there, we've seen some British small arms and I believe engines for sort of personnel carriers or vehicles found on the battlefield. So we know that there's a pipeline where British arms are going to the UAE and then those arms are going to the RSF, which I think is something that the British government should be held to account over. But yeah, no, I agree with you. I actually, it's bleak, but I see sort of limited maneuver for the international community. I also hate that term, to do anything. But at the very least, if there could be some kind of safe passage negotiated for civilians. I remember when this was mooted, I remember saying at the time, when has the Janjaweed ever agreed to safe passage for anyone? Should also say that the Sudanese armed forces are not angels in all of this. I think that we've slipped into this kind of a simplistic narrative in the media where, you know, the RSF are committing a genocide and the Sudanese armed forces are a government, what's left of a government, under pressure from this group. They've also committed atrocities. And there was convincing reporting that I saw from some Sudanese journalists that some of the Sudanese armed forces inside El Fasher, just before the RSF took the city, negotiated safe passage for themselves, in effect abandoning the civilians inside the city to their own fate. So look, I don't know what's going to happen next. It's definitely one of those situations where at the moment it's hard to see a way out, and it's hard to see what incentivizes the international community to try to stop it.
Before we move on, I just want to sort of look at one more angle of this, which sort of I've heard discussed. And I suppose which potentially connects a number of sort of conflicts in this region, which is the Red Sea. So I'm going to bring up a map, which you can see now. So obviously, Sudan is on the Red Sea. In case you're listening to this on the podcast, the Red Sea is the bit of sea which essentially connects the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean, which means that it's sort of a key route for all trade between Europe and Asia. So very, very significant. At the top of it, you've got Egypt, Israel, Jordan. Then you've got Saudi Arabia to the east. And to the west, you've got Egypt, Sudan, then Eritrea, Djibouti, Somalia, and then also to the east, actually, you've got Yemen. And sort of looking at these, Barry, lots of these countries have had very, very bloody conflicts in recent years. So Yemen, obviously, that ended up being a proxy war with the Saudis and the UAE on the same side that time. Iran was backing the Houthis. We talked about Ethiopia and Eritrea and Djibouti and sort of the possibility of conflict and the reality of conflict there. Somalia, obviously, often in quite deadly conflict, or at least the state not functioning particularly well. To what extent is sort of this about control of the Red Sea, and does that sort of connect lots of the conflicts we see in this region?
You say it's one of the most strategically important waterways in the world. I mean, for commerce, but also militarily. There are already a lot of military bases along the Red Sea, and the UAE already has one. It has a base in Assab in Eritrea, and that base was incredibly important for UAE operations in Yemen. Djibouti, I think, hosts 3 military bases. There's a US military base, there's a Chinese military base, and there's a French military base. And then if you go around the corner to the Horn, the UAE, as sort of a private company, as much as a company can be private in the UAE, controls the port of Bosaso in Somaliland effectively. And actually, that's another route where people are saying that arms are coming into Sudan through Bosaso. And so there are already a bunch of military bases, and everybody is sort of scrambling for a perch there. And Russia, I think, really, really wants and has wanted for a very, very long time a military base at Port Sudan. And they had at one point agreed a deal to build that base with the Sudanese government. And that deal has now been put on pause. And, of all the powers involved in the conflict, Russia has kind of been playing both sides off each other because, for a long time, Wagner was already involved in Sudan, and they were close to the RSF and were also engaging in gold deals with the RSF. But then Russia has also stayed kind of close to the Sudanese armed forces. And I think that partly removing that deal or pausing that deal is the Sudanese armed forces' way of keeping some leverage in the pocket for Russia. Saying that if Russia continues to support them, if Russia turns its back on the RSF, then they're dangling that prospect of a military base in Port Sudan, which Putin has wanted for a really, really long time. And so, strategically, the Red Sea is incredibly important. And whether the Sudanese armed forces controls it or whether the RSF controls it, for either of them, it's such an incredible cherry to offer to foreign backers.
It's long been common knowledge that Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein go way back. Trump has always, of course, though, denied knowing of Epstein's crimes. That claim, though, might no longer be tenable. House Democrats have released emails they've obtained from the Epstein estate, and they're pretty damning. So the first is an exchange between Ghislaine Maxwell and Epstein from 2011, so quite a while ago. And it says this. So the first email is from Jeffrey Epstein to Ghislaine, and he says, "I want you to realize that the dog that hasn't barked is Trump. Victim," and that's sort of blanked out, "spent hours at my house with him. He has never once been mentioned. Police chief, etc. I'm 75% there." Now, some of that, the dog that hasn't barked, I'm 75% there. There's a number of ways of sort of interpreting that. The context here is that Epstein pled guilty in 2008 to procuring an under 18, or I think maybe multiple under 18-year-olds for prostitution. Obviously, the whole thing there was that it was some sort of cover-up. He didn't really go to proper prison, and lots of his crimes hadn't been outed then, but many of them had. In 2011, he'd been complaining apparently about negative media coverage he was receiving. At the time, Trump was a reality TV star. So I suppose my interpretation here is that him and Ghislaine are saying, or the discussion is, why am I, Jeffrey Epstein, getting all this negative media attention when other very famous people who definitely are implicated, that's the implication of this email, aren't getting any? And then you've got Ghislaine saying, she said, "I have been thinking about that." So he's saying, Trump is the dog that hadn't barked. He's spent ages in my house with, alleged victim. Ghislaine says, "I've been thinking about that." So, that seems credible, let's say. And the second email exchange is from 2015. This is when Trump was running for president. It's between Epstein and the author, Michael Wolff. So this, I think, is slightly different because he's speaking to a journalist, and he's obviously a very manipulative, dishonest man. But this is before a Republican primary debate. So here I'm starting from the bottom because that's how you see how the internet conversation happens. So Michael Wolff on December the 15th, 2015, emails Epstein to say, I hear CNN are planning to ask Trump tonight about his relationship with you, either on air or in Scrum afterwards. So this is just before a Republican primary debate. And then Epstein curiously says, if we were able to craft an answer for him, what do you think it should be? So that's sort of a suggestion that Jeffrey Epstein thinks he might have an in to feed Trump an answer for this debate. And then this is Michael Wolff's reply. So Michael Wolff says, I think you should let him hang himself. If he says he hasn't been on the plane or to the House, then that gives you valuable PR and political currency. You can hang him in a way that potentially generates a positive benefit for you, or if it really looks like he could win, you could save him, generating a debt. Of course, it is possible that when asked, he'll say Jeffrey is a great guy and has gotten a raw deal and is a victim of political correctness, which is to be outlawed in a Trump regime. So this is really, really interesting. Trump at this point is running for president. I mean, it's very odd that Jeffrey Epstein is asking this, or it's somewhat embarrassing for this author, one would have thought, but he's asking this author for advice on what should I feed Trump if I were to be able to feed him something. And Michael Wolff seems to be saying, let him hang himself. If he says Jeffrey's a great guy, good for you. If he claims not to know you, or not to have been on the plane, then you can either out him, which sort of, I don't know why that would generate positive benefit for you, but there we are. Or if it looks like he could win, you can save him, generating a debt. That's really interesting. So he's saying, if he wins, you say, look, Trump, I'm not going to tell anyone about your involvement, but please, can you help me out? Maybe that happened. Who knows? Apparently Trump was, well, not apparently, we know Trump was not asked about Epstein in the debate that those emails came before. There's a third email. It's between Epstein and Michael Wolff again, but this time from 2019. So when Trump is already at that point president, Michael Wolff had by then written what became quite a famous tell-all book about Trump's time in the White House, which involved lots of him sort of eating McDonald's and watching Fox News, as far as I understand. So this is the email then. So it's from Jeffrey Epstein to Michael Wolff, 2019. And again, we've got a blanked out victim, Mar-a-Lago, and then something else blanked out. And then this is Epstein saying, Trump said he asked me to resign, never remember ever. Of course he knew about the girls as he asked Ghislaine to stop. I'm not sure what, asked Ghislaine to stop. There was sort of that he was trying to steal people from Mar-a-Lago from him at one point. I don't know if that's a reference to that. This final email, I give the least value to in a way, because it is Jeffrey Epstein saying something to a journalist that makes Jeffrey Epstein look better. Not better. I mean, Jeffrey Epstein already looks very terrible by this point in time. But, it's someone saying he didn't ask me to resign. I was never a member anyway. Right. Someone with a big ego telling that to a journalist. I don't put so much credence on that. But I do think the email exchange between him and Ghislaine in 2011 seems to me absolutely damning. And then the one from 2015 seems, I suppose, again, maybe he's, it sounds like him and Michael Wolff have had lots of conversations about Donald Trump and the influence that Epstein may or may not have over him. Barry, what do you make of these 3 emails? Have we learned something significantly new that we didn't know already?
They're pretty damning. I mean, they've come out with no context, but on the surface of it, they look bad. I mean, I think the one that is most damaging for him is the one where Epstein says he spent hours with victim redacted, because the House Democrats who released the emails have redacted that name, but they have said that it is a victim. And I think that's incredibly damning for him, because while Trump has admitted to being friends with Epstein, has admitted that he had a relationship with him, I think said that they fell out sometime in the early 2000s, he has always claimed that he had no knowledge of the trafficking. I think he's admitted or claimed that Epstein was a quote unquote creep when he was at Mar-a-Lago, and that's why he sort of expelled him, which obviously Epstein has denied in that email. But he always said that he didn't know about the trafficking. I think we have 2 emails here which suggest that he may have, depending on the context from which they came. And I do think that since Trump came into office, the Epstein thing has been his greatest weakness. I think it's the thing that has applied the most pressure to his presidency. And that pressure was already there before these emails leaked. There's a representative-elect, a congresswoman from Arizona, who is supposed to be sworn in, I think, this week or next week. And once she's sworn in, she's going to become the 218th signee needed to force a vote on releasing the so-called Epstein files. I believe they've held up her swearing in for a really long time. It's the longest time between somebody being elected and sworn in this century. And she's been saying all along that when she's in, she's going to vote this way to force this vote on the Epstein files. And obviously today with these emails coming out, that pressure is only going to grow. So then the question is, how does it play with his MAGA base? You know, I think that he had said very convincingly years ago that he could go out on Fifth Avenue and murder somebody and people would still vote for him. I think that's true with the base, but I think he needs more than his base. And we've already seen that this Epstein thing has alienated even some Republicans. So, look, I don't see that the pressure is going to go away, especially with this congresswoman coming in and the potential to force a vote on this. And the longer it stays in the headlines, the longer it's going to damage him. Because even with the current makeup of the Republican Party, I think there are people in the Republican Party for whom child trafficking is, perhaps a step too far.
We don't have time to discuss this angle properly because the show's about to end, but I just want to draw our audience attention to Dropsite News, who have published a series of articles based on another tranche of leaked emails. So these are emails from former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. They were released by a pro-Palestinian hacking group with speculative ties to Iran. That's how it's described by Dropsite News. And I'm just going to read, they've got a series of stories about Epstein in Israel. These are 4 headlines from them. They say, Jeffrey Epstein helped broker Israeli security agreement with Mongolia. The next one is Jeffrey Epstein and the Mossad, how the sex trafficker helped Israel build a back channel to Russia amid Syrian civil war. Then there's Jeffrey Epstein helped Israel sell a surveillance state to Côte d'Ivoire, so the Ivory Coast. And then their most recent one, just from yesterday, Israeli spies stayed for weeks at a time with Jeffrey Epstein in Manhattan. So obviously we have sort of drawn attention many times on this show to the potential connections between Jeffrey Epstein and Israeli intelligence. It seems like Dropsite News have got a lot more information on that front. I'm going to try and get one of them on the show soon to discuss this in more detail. For now, you can go check out those stories yourself. Barry, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you everyone for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.